Just to tell you a little bit about myself, apart from the fact that I'm dyslexic. I'm Italian, 3/4 Italian and 1/4 Irish. So whilst John apologised that you weren't all Scottish, I asked for your empathy. Not easy being in this body. So it's a tension I hold. So just to begin by saying Kairos is focused very much on what John was saying. It's an absolutely fantastic opportunity that we have found ahead of us. The forum has been founded on friendship. It's born out of friendship, and it has friendship underpinning absolutely everything we do. Everything comes from that. Why Kairos? I'll tell you at the end. I'm sorry, you have to wait. But the job that we have before us is to foster communities of belonging through attention to the spiritual. So everything we do, everything that we share, all the work that we do when we're out in communities has an attention to the spiritual and to this concept of belonging rather than inclusion. John said something very powerful on one of the workshops we were doing once when we were in Lourdes. He said, how about if we all think that we're including people with disabilities into all that we do? But how about if God is doing something quite amazing with the community of people who have disabilities or seem to be on the margins, and we're actually on the outside looking in, and those that need to be included are those that presume that they need to bring people into what they're doing. So on the base of this, we've developed and come together. We've very, very, very luckily been given funding for the first 2 years to set up this organisation, which we hope in the UK and across whoever wants us, we'll go anywhere. Is that right? Will we go anywhere? Yeah, anywhere. Hopefully we'll be able to put theory into practice and begin to look at practice and put it into theory. But what I want to tell you about today is a really exciting project that we've completed. The research report is out on the table outside. It's very, very thick because the amount of information we received was just unending. And I just want to tell you a little bit about it now because we think it's quite important. Before I worked as co-director of the Kairos Forum, I was the disability advisor in the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Southwark. And the work that we were doing was very, very new. We were training thousands and thousands of catechists. We were working right across the country, advising to the Bishops' Conference, and in the workshop this afternoon, if you're interested, I'd be able to tell you more about what we've done. But one of the things we decided was not quite as it should be is that we kept working with catechists, with families, doing things for disabled people, but we didn't really have a voice that was telling us exactly what the person themselves, whether they be disabled or not, thought spirituality was and what they needed so as to be able to practice religiously. So we came together with this idea, John and I, of putting together a research project which will enable communities to meet people with disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, and respond to their spiritual and religious need. And it was a participatory action research approach. Not easy to say when you're dyslexic. And what I want to do today is, I can't give you the whole of the project of research because my colleague says I can't. You have to wait till the launch. But what I want to do is just to begin to focus on a couple of the outcomes and a very big paradox that we found and that I hope to be able to explain and share with you today. How I tell this story, I hope. We've heard a lot about stories, we've heard a lot about hospitality, but how I tell you this story this morning, I hope will free the voice of the amazing people that spoke with us and that shared time with us, whether it be through the use of symbols, as you can see here on the picture, or whether it be just through who they were. So let's go. One of the things that we discovered when we started to do the research is that everybody kept saying to us, we need to be breaking down barriers. We need to have barriers broken down so as that people know who we are, and the people in the churches need to say, well, there are barriers and sort of barriers, languages, we don't know what to do, we're terrified, never met anybody with a disability before. All that sort of language came through, and I'm sure that those of us in this room, we all have encountered that language before. What we discovered was that there was a sense of, within the secular world, there were many, many people, especially in the field of special education, who knew how to make services accessible to people with intellectual disabilities through symbols, Makaton, signing, widget, spread, all sorts of different processes. But they didn't really know why spirituality was important, and I think we heard a little bit about that tension last night. We then went into our churches and we began to listen to communities, and they seemed to know why spirituality was so important to every single person, but they didn't know how to translate complex theological or religious practice terms into a way that would communicate the meaning. So we had this paradox, people that knew how but didn't know why, people that knew why but didn't know how, and never the twain should meet. So we decided that what we had to do was create some sort of process, some sort of resource, some sort of naming that will enable community building, because as John said, spirituality is something we do together, and we heard this morning how hospitality was so vital, and doing things together rather than on separate tables is so important. So we came up with this resource that came out of our research, and the name of the resource is a 5-week journey together, and it's called Everybody Has a Story, and I'd like you to just notice how there is a pun on the capital B, and as much as that's everybody has a story. Where was the research conducted? The research was conducted with 30 people, aged 16 to 70, of varying levels of intellectual disabilities and religious beliefs. What we did was we began to say, well, you know, we don't want to just do it in church because we're only going to get a certain set of outcomes. And we don't want to just go to a residential home because we're only going to get a certain set of outcomes. Actually, if the church doors are open, anybody can come. And so therefore we want to be able to look at our choose people or begin to invite people to be part of the research from the whole experience of life. So we came up with this TCLE, that's not tickle, nothing to do with the lap dance. TCLE, the cycle of life experience of people with, well, just of all people, but especially people with intellectual disabilities. So we began to look at family, and we invited people from families. We looked at schools where people with intellectual disabilities would go to school. So we did our research in a school for a secondary school. That in the States, it would be from age 11 to 16. So from in the sixth form of secondary school for children with special needs. We went to a college where they had groups of people who went to college after the special ed school or mainstream school. We did our research in a residential home because family, school, then to college. Then after college, either you stay at home in family or you may move into a residential home. A day centre, which is where many people with intellectual disabilities seem to go during the day, and in a faith community. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. So we had the 30 people that joined in, that took up the invitation that we offered in doing the research, came from this cycle of life experience, which gave us a really wide vision of the life and the reality of people with intellectual disabilities. And as I say, they were of varying levels. Some were verbal, non-verbal, and lots did different things in different ways. what we discovered from the very, very, very beginning of our research is that there was an intuitive sense. Every single person that joined our groups had an intuitive sense of their inner being. And this, as we were doing our focus groups, was coupled with a real urgency to narrate their story. Self-expression was so important that we found that the more the people joined in our focus groups, which if you come or if you join us for the launch, you'll know a little bit more about. But the way in which we did our focus groups, which was through pictures, which was through invitation, we discovered this absolute outpouring of information. It was almost as if somebody wants to hear, somebody wants to share, somebody wants to know, and there was this urgency to narrate the story. So what we began to reflect was that having a story to tell, a place to tell it, and someone to receive that story generated a sense and a place of belonging, where spirituality, where religious practice, and where community could be built. What we did find, however, is that in each of the communities we worked in, or we conducted our research in, we found an utter poverty of space for this to occur. And I think we heard about that this morning. It connects very much to what we were saying this morning. Even within a faith community that said it was inclusive, that had so much going on for people with disabilities and special masses and special services and special worship groups, even there was a real poverty for the person to outpour their story. Life seemed to be prescribed, and so was faith. This is what we believe. This is how we're going to help you learn it. This is how we're going to communicate it to you, and that's how you'll believe it. We found that in the residential home, there was the other way around. In the residential home, whilst they were saying in England, by law, you have to account for the spiritual needs of people with various disabilities. So if somebody's in a residential home, they have to have their spiritual needs accounted for. So when we asked some of the care staff in the residential home, how do you support the spiritual needs of people with intellectual disabilities, or people in your house, they said, oh, well, he doesn't want to go, he doesn't like church, but he goes to church. We have one of our care take him to church on a Sunday. What they didn't know in the residential home is that when they got to church on the Sunday, when we interviewed the people in the church on the Sunday, they said, oh yeah, it's really great, they do come, they sit in the hall for the whole of Mass and have coffee. Obviously, this was in a Catholic community. So they sit and have coffee, and then at the end of Mass, by the time everybody else goes in, they've gone. So we don't really get a chance to meet them. So the residential home felt that they were catering for their spiritual needs, and the church felt that they were catering for their spiritual needs, but actually there was no space to tell their story. And what I discovered when I went into one of the residential homes that I was working with this young man called Wilfred, is that there was another chap called John. And as I was standing, he kept looking over at me, and I just sort of caught his eye, and he went, come here. So I went up to him and I said, yes, John, what can I help you with? And he said, I want to go to church. And he said it so quietly, as if he said it too loud, the care staff would become angry because they decided that on a Sunday morning that wasn't part of his prescribed life. It wasn't in his timetable, going to church on a Sunday. So when we asked the residential home about this, they said, look, he has autonomy. He can choose for himself. He's an independent chap. If he wants to go, he goes, and if he doesn't want to go, he doesn't. So autonomy became a tool, whether it be for the church or whether it be for the residential home, to deny a true space for that person to belong, for him to go to church and discover who Jesus was, or to be with God, with Jesus, wherever it was that he went to church. So autonomy in this case became a sort of form of denial. And it was something we began to look at. So, we discovered that within this lack of opportunity to choose authentic settings and relationships, activities and people with whom to relate became almost impossible. There was no choice. If they were taken to the local church around the corner, that's who they had to become friends with. If people decided from the local volunteers group that they were going into the residential home to have coffee with the person who had a disability, that's who they had to become friends with. There was very little choice. It seemed to be always people going in and doing too. Whilst there was an attempt to do with, it didn't quite get there. So what we found as a result of this part of our research, and I do want to highlight that this is only part of it, we found incredible stories of hope, we had incredible laughter, and really a very positive outcome. But this is just something that I thought was really important when we're looking at spiritual needs of people with intellectual disabilities. We found that as a result of this lack of opportunity, there was a heightened loneliness, feeling different, even in body language, in the way in which some of our participants, when we asked how they felt, they would and move themselves away from everybody else. So reading the body language, feeling different, a need to please and to always be happy. It seemed that if the person with the intellectual disability, whether it be in the church, whether it be in the school, whether it be in the residential home, was sad or was troubled, somebody would say, now come on, what can we do? Let's do something to make you happy. You mustn't be. There was this constant need to be happy. And one of our residents one day in the workshop that we were doing actually put their head on the table and we said, are you okay? And he just cried and we didn't know why, and we worked with him on that. So, what we've begun to explore in our research project is that within the life of people with intellectual disabilities, there could exist a paradox. And I want to just share that with you now and see if it means anything to you. We've put it in a sort of philosophical argument, and I hope that it will relate to you, and if it's not understandable, please do put your hand up and I'll explain more. To have a relationship, it is indispensable to have agreement before that relationship occurs. And by agreement we intend the consent of both parties, not an enforced embrace. Not a, I'm coming to visit you from a Christian community or from a religious community, do you love me? I love you. Okay, so to have an agreement, it is indispensable, to have a relationship, it's indispensable to have the agreement of both parties, not an enforced embrace. But that puts up something that could be possible, but impossible. Let's look at why. To have an agreement with people who have an intellectual disability could seem almost impossible. But at the same time, it could be too possible because of issues of loneliness. Let's open that up a little. To have a relationship with people who have an intellectual disability could seem impossible because of differing language skills, cognitive skills, barriers of communication, and sometimes difficulty in empathising. This leaves it very difficult to achieve the effective agreement that we've said. So if to have an effective agreement means to have the consent of both parties, if one party communicates in a different way to the other, then that could be very difficult. Therefore, a relationship occurs within the life experience of the person with intellectual disability, which is based on needs and not will. And there we have people who know how but don't know why, people that know why but don't know how, and so somebody does something. But it's not always something that the person with the intellectual disability has shown that they want and they need. So our relationship becomes functional rather than spiritual. But this could leave the person with an intellectual disability searching. Because in between that paradox, in between that in-between place, they could be searching. If nobody understands me, that leaves me lonely, that leaves me isolated. If somebody wants to do too much to me, that leaves me frustrated because I don't have a space to tell you who I am. It could leave the person needy, vulnerable, and lonely. And when people are needy, vulnerable, and lonely, they reach out. And so therefore a relationship within that situation where there isn't an effective agreement becomes a search for authentic friendship, but a very vulnerable place to be. Because that invitation could be abused. There could be forced hospitality, being given too much to do and not enough time to do it. One of the people we worked with, Christopher, and I have permission to use all of the names and all of the pictures. When we were doing the workshop and we were looking at, all of the things that we do in our life, Christopher stopped, and at a certain time we began to really watch and read every single piece of body language. And Christopher just huffed. And we said, Christopher, what's wrong? And he said, there's so much to do, but there's not enough time to do it in. And he used this language of too much and too little. And we said, well, what do you mean? He said, I've got so many things that I have to do. And he took out his schedule, his timetable that he'd been given by the residential home in the morning. And he said, I've got all this to do, and there's so much. And he said, but there's only that much time, and I can't fit it in. And what he was saying to us was, hey, slow down. Take it easy. Listen to my story. Pay attention to who I am. And as such, you'll know and you'll be able to meet me. And here's Christopher pointing to his book and saying, oi, take some notice of me. Within this journey, whilst we found this paradox, people were lonely because people didn't understand them. And because they were lonely, they reached out. When they reached out, people didn't know how. Because we had this paradox, we named it the paradox of effective agreement. Now, has everybody understood it? Oh dear. Is that a yes or no? No, I can answer questions about it in the end. So over and above this paradox, this very difficult place to be, this in-between place, we found incredible stories that pointed towards hope and change and a real joie de vivre. And I'm Italian, so I've probably spelt that French incorrectly. But there was a real joy for life, absolutely, and a real call to community. But in all of this reaching out, in all of this paradox, there was this constant need to narrate the story of the person. And the moment that we gave that space, and the moment that we named that tension that exists within our communities and the life of the person with intellectual disability, or the lives of the people in our research, everything began to calm down and we began to look for a solution. So research evidence suggests that people with intellectual disabilities are often excluded from religious and spiritual activities, and we've heard this the whole of the 5 days that we've been here together. We've heard this. People with intellectual disabilities are often excluded. So does that mean, therefore, that this paradox, not knowing how and why, this paradox of not actually finding correct language, a construct that the paradox that exists within our structures and rituals are made of words, familiar ways of doing things, and the need to achieve a learning outcome rather than share. So when we do religious programs, when we have our programs of friendship, when we have anything that we do in our churches, from whatever it is that we prepare, do we go there needing to have an outcome? Do we go there deciding that's the way we're going to do it? Do we use words because that's what we always use? Or do we begin to think about another way? And the question that I have is, who is autistic? How autistic is our theology? And is there a place for paradox? Or is there a place that we have to create where the breathing in and the breathing out of God brings a new story? So, we discovered that effective relationships, and again, I can only give you a taste of the research because the whole of the report is yet to come. But we discovered that effective relationship was born through hospitality, and we've heard that this morning. That was a powerful message, and I thought how great it was that the two linked up. And we began to think about a possible solution to this. How do we break down these barriers of words and these barriers of usual ways of doing things and patterns so as to ensure that all people can belong? And what we discovered, that within our life circle, within the TCLE, the life circle of people's experience, the religious community was a rich target audience. It was a place to be. This is where it could happen. Why? Because if you look at the life circle of a person with intellectual disability, something could be done in a family, absolutely. Something could be done in the schools, absolutely. You could do work on spirituality and belonging. In the residential home, of course, you could train the staff. But when will the people ever come together? That could happen in the school, it could happen in the home, but it could happen in isolation. But on any given Sunday or any given Sabbath or any given day when a religious community gathers, then you have the space for the story. Because you have people who come with their child who's just been born, with their young son who is going to the local school, with somebody who lives in the residential home, with somebody that's at the college, with somebody from every single corner or every single group within that cycle. It's the religious community that gathers. So when we say we gather as a community, we have to ask ourselves, where within that gathering do we provide the space for the story to be told, for the existence of the person to belong, and for the paradox to disappear? And how do we do that? We found that when we began to take some of the outcomes and when we began to actually work with the paradox and we began to see how we could overcome it, we began to get outcomes beyond our research that were profound. We gave a training session to one of our bishops on the paradox of effective agreement. We spent some time with him, and we were working and looking at, through encounter and learning from the person, new forms of communication began to emerge. We didn't decide what the forms of communication were. We learned from the person, and I'll explain that in a second. What our bishop decided was to learn to sign. Well, he said, well, if that's so, and there's a group of people that I'm sharing with that don't understand what I'm, or not engaging with what I'm doing and what I'm saying, then I have to change. And we discovered that to be able to overcome this paradox, to be able to make the space for people to belong, there needs to be an absolute paradigm shift in what it means to be human. And I think that that's something that has come out so strongly and was affirmed in what John was saying in our theology this morning. So a rediscovering of what it means to be human will bring about hospitable and authentic relationships, and it's absolutely vital in the solving of this paradox. So, what did we do? What we decided was we had to try and create something that would begin to bring about some sort of solution to this paradox, some sort of solution that would stop the how and why, that would break down the barriers of the different ways of communicating and would facilitate a meeting of people, so that really the disability, the dis side of that word disability, could almost be dissolved. And we found that the religious community was most definitely the community that wanted to do it the most. And we had some great outcomes from that. So the solution comes in this. Every action a human being undertakes has the potential to communicate information to another person or persons under the right circumstances. The greatest majority of humanity is able to competently communicate verbally, so that's the typical. But we don't consciously recognise or pay attention to the approximately 80% of non-verbal sensory human communication. Our speaking is only a part, 20%, of what we do. If we're dancing, people know what we're doing because we're dancing. If we're smiling, people know what we're doing if we're smiling. If we're sad, our heads are down, our shoulders are down. Our body speaks of what we do and who we are far more than our words can. Because sometimes the words that come out, are you happy? Yeah, I'm really happy. Are not always what they should be. It doesn't always tell you what's happening inside the body. And this is a quote from, in all of the research that we did, we had a specialist from Mackerton who walked beside us. And Mackerton is a very, very well-used sign language in England. And he was a real speech and communication specialist. He was a non-believer, but he walked alongside us at the level of our communication because we wanted to draw on the skills of all. And he said this: "We therefore very often listen and do not look, and see, we very often listen and do not look, and see but do not hear." And that took me back to the gospel, and I went back and I tried to discover all of the times that Jesus said this, and he was always pointing to it. And he said, they have eyes and ears, but they do not see and they do not hear. And the disciples said to him, "What do you mean by that, Lord?" And he leaves it open. And the question is, who is Jesus directing that to? Do we say that as church we have eyes and we know, Lord? Or is it that even within our communities we continue to hold this paradox where we think that we're creating a space for the story to be told, but somehow, maybe, sometimes what we're doing is a prescribed way of being, a prescribed way of believing, and we also have our prescribed ways of doing things. So as a consequence, we miss out, and I think that's another thing you said this morning that was absolutely fantastic. We really do miss out on important communicative information and understanding, but more than anything, we miss out on people who belong to the human story. And if they're not in our parishes, if they're not in our congregations as the body of Christ are absolutely incomplete. And there's no place for the paradox within that, but there's every place for every person. So we came up with this, that all sounds very good, doesn't it? But how do you do it? If we were to say to you, our research has found this, the paradox, and it's a little bit complicated, and you need to do this, and you need to discover languages, and you need to be able to communicate in this way, but we don't then begin to say, how do we do that? Then we remain ourselves in the paradox constantly. So we've come up with this process of communication, and we're wondering, and part of showing it you today is to see how everybody finds it. We're wondering if it helps. It's a process called PAC, P-P-A-C. And basically, it occurs before you communicate. So before the forced embrace occurs, before you tell somebody what they're going to be doing, before you even begin to say hello, this becomes part of your being, and as such begins to build in the theology that John was speaking of earlier, a theology of being and of presence. So let's go through it. P, the first P. When you have a person before you You perceive the language of their body. So even as that person is coming towards you, even if you know that you're going to meet someone, before you even start to talk or say, "Hi, how are you? It's really good to see you," or sign or whatever, you perceive the language of that body. How does that person relate to the environment, to their peers, and to the people around them? And as a research team, that became very, very important with each person we met. So once you've done that, it takes seconds, you've perceived the language of that person's body, you then begin to pay attention. So what we did when we had our participants, even as they came into the room, we paid attention to how they communicated. How did they begin the conversation? Was it with a sound, with a blink? Was it with a breath? Was it with a head down, a head up? Were they happy? Were they sad? What were they communicating to us? What were their movements? Then we decided what we had to do next was to absorb. Okay, so we've perceived their language, we've paid attention to how they communicate. Then we begin to absorb that person. We learn from them, gaining new information so as that we begin to transcend our own selves, the way that we communicate. And that really tied in with what I've been hearing, and I heard so many times about the breathing in, a breathing out, the ever self-transcending God. That actually in absorbing this person's way of being, what we were actually doing was living with the breath of God. All of us. And then we communicated. We effectively tuned in to that person's way of being. And we discovered after a couple of weeks of practicing this, and that you have a handout that explains it all, probably better than I have. But this pack it all in. We used to say to each other before we went into our research groups, we used to say, pack it all in then, pack it all in, which meant just make sure you do that before you even dare to communicate with someone. Because if we are achieving an effective agreement where both people are consenting in that journey of communication, then we can be sure that what we do from that is honest. So, almost finished. I'd like to be able to stand here and give you reams of theology, but we're still working on it. And it is the outcomes of... this outpouring from the participants, this telling of story, this showing of story, this communicating of being that occurred has really begun to take us to incarnation theology. And we began to ask, PPAC, is that how God communicated through Christ? Is it that God needed to perceive us, pay attention to who we were, absorb us somehow, and then communicate with us in the person of Christ? It's taken us back to creation theology because we've had to look at how the body is, and we've had to begin to see how do we see that breathing in and breathing out of God, and what does it say about the created person? Learning the language of the body, it's all about belonging. We discovered a cyclical model of spirituality. There was a return to the self all the time, no matter what happened, whether it was sad, whether it was happy, whatever we did. At the end of the session, or whenever we were sharing something, there was this return to the self. The people we were with always took us back to themselves. And what we discovered in their talking about God was that they weren't reaching out for God. There was no reaching out for God. But there was a sense to those of us that were in the research team that God was just there all the time. It was just a constant meeting and being with God, God with us all the time. And one of our participants said, "Cristina," and I said, "Yeah, what's?" She said, God talks to me, Jesus talks to me. And I said, "Does he?" We listened to everything that was said. We discounted nothing. Whatever came, body, word, sound, movement, we noted it, we read it. So I said to her, what does Jesus say then? She said, well, he just, where does he talk to you? There. So I said, okay. And she said, not all the time. He does go away, but he always comes back. And then she said something that was absolutely profound. And she said, sometimes it's somebody else that talks to us, but I know it's him really. And there she began to talk about the reciprocal relationship with God. She began to talk about recognising God in the other. And this was a person for whom most people, she would be the other. It was an experience of kenosis, absolutely a total emptying of ourselves. We had to remove all possible ways that we had discovered or we thought was right to work with people with intellectual disabilities. It was absolute kenosis. And we began to ask ourselves again, is this what God did when he wanted to get to know us? Did he have to really just empty himself completely to take on the form of a servant? I've got no answers for you because it's still on its way. It is coming, and hopefully in the autumn we'll be launching the research. We'll be launching Everybody Has a Story as a resource that can be purchased and used in communities. It's a work in progress. The difficulty is it just keeps growing. Every time we sit to work with it, something else comes up, and John and I have a terrible argument. That's not true, it really isn't true. So the course is designed to be easy and accessible for people for many, many communities. It's about community building. It will be a little DVD with a little booklet. You'll be able to put it into the laptop and read a training session helping you to use the resources to enable the story of the person to be expressed. It will give you all the theories, how to do PPAC, etc., etc. And then you'll download absolutely everything that you need, we hope, to run it. But hopefully then, as you meet the people, you'll begin to develop your own resources as you learn the language of their bodies. The idea is to encourage people with intellectual disabilities to reflect spiritually and theologically on what is important in their lives. It's designed to release the voice of people with intellectual disabilities, release the expression of people with intellectual disabilities, and bring their story to the front, so that it's not us telling their story, but it's the person themselves telling their own story. It's a journey which creates an intentional space for freedom of expression, so as to help people develop their perspective of their lives that are spiritual and for some deeply religious. The task of the religious community, the residential home, the college, the school that will use, we hope, this resource, is not that they say, oh, okay, we've met this person now, they're going to do this. But it's that they spend 5 weeks getting to know how people communicate. And then, and only then, do they turn back and look at their structures and begin to remove that paradox and begin to make the structures something that all can understand. And if we think about it, isn't that just what Jesus did? Amazing story sharing with amazing people. Not because of their disability, but simply because of who they are. And the experience that we have and what we've heard in this conference just gives absolute witness to that. Living together and allowing each other's story to inspire one another. And I want to just end with one story. Love paid out in action. When we were doing our research, the focus groups at the very beginning, we very, very quickly realised that we couldn't be just asking questions and getting answers, that we had to do something that was a little bit different. And when we began to invite people to be part of our research, our focus groups, one of the residential staff said to us, it's no good having John Oliver, he doesn't say anything other than Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. There'll be no point having him. So we came up with our answer, and we said, well, even John Oliver, who says Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, is welcome in a church, in a faith community. So we don't really want to make any restrictions, because if we want to learn the language of the body, if we want to be able to solve the paradox, then everybody's welcome. So John Oliver joined our focus group, and he came in, and we made sure that we, using PPAC, we made sure that we tried to overcome this difficulty that everybody seemed to have with his communication. So John Oliver would sit in the group, and you'd say, "Hi, John Oliver," hello, and he'd wave, and we would go through this, ask him questions, and we did it through using symbols and changing pictures and making a big letter and putting pictures on the wall and choosing and moving. And John Oliver started to say one day, "Cristina," and I said, "Yes, John Oliver. Is today Monday?" "No." "Tuesday?" "No." "And after Tuesday comes Wednesday. And after Wednesday, Thursday. And after Thursday, Friday," until he got to Sunday. And then I said to him, "Sunday?" And he said, "Go to church on Sunday with my mum." So John Oliver had never said "with my mum," he'd only ever said "go to church on Sunday." So we did a little bit of working with him and asking him questions about, "Do you go to church with your mum?" "No." And he put his head down, reading the language of the body. There was something difficult there. "Tell me about your mum." And he says, "She died." And what we realised was that the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday was just to get him back to Sunday so that he could remember his mum, a return to the self. Return to the self. He wanted to remember his mum. We acknowledged that pain. We sat with him. We said, "Really sorry, John, it must be very sad." And we spent time with him in that moment. And from then on, he was the first. And I think this came back to Stephen's story as I was listening to it at the very beginning of the conference. It just, my heart was coming out of my it wasn't coming out of my chest, that's a ridiculous thing to say, but it was pounding. Because it meant that he was there all of a sudden. We'd removed the barrier, we'd got rid of the paradox, and he was with us. And we asked him this question: "John Oliver, why do you think you're in this world?" Theologians, research, we're looking for some in-depth understanding, some spiritual revelation. And do you know what he said to us? "Because I am." That was it. Why are you looking for a reason? Why are you trying to find out whether I'm a person or not a person? I'm here. I'm me, and I am. And from that moment on, our research took on a very different story. Because if love is paid out in action, if God is the I am, then every single person here, no matter what their body's like, or no matter the way they think or communicate, is. And that's it. Thank you for listening.